Last time on the Discover the Word podcast, Elisa Morgan, Bill Crowder, Daniel Ryan Day, and Rasul Berry started a two-part series of conversations about what's called the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. 9 characteristics that show up in our lives that signal that the Spirit of God is at work in us. We're calling this study Fruitful Living. And as part of it, Elisa said,
I chose a specific physical fruit to express each of the fruit of the Spirit, kind of as a memory device for us. I mean, these are not literal. I just made them up, okay? Just full disclosure.
Yeah, but I think grapes and cherries, blueberries and coconuts, pineapples and strawberries were all a helpful way of remembering the fruit of the Spirit and what it looks like when those characteristics are part of who others see us to be. We have a few more elements to add to the list and a few more fruit to attach to them. So pull your chair up to the table with Elisa and Bill and Daniel and Rasul for part 2 of our conversations about Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit, and fruitful living. And welcome to Discover the Word, a Bible engagement effort of Our Daily Bread Ministries. Now, Our Daily Bread Ministries is a donor-supported global ministry that is dedicated to making the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible come alive for people all around the world. And we do that on Discover the Word with a group study model that explores passages and topics together. And in part 2 of this Fruitful Living study, we're going to cover the last 3 characteristics of the 9 listed as the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23. We're also going to attach a physical fruit to each of them, and then spend some time talking about ways we can have this be our legacy, because the fruit of the Spirit is really those 9 characteristics that describe what God is like showing up in our personality. It's what we look like when we look like Him. All right, so let's get caught up and review for a moment where we've been, and then we'll keep moving ahead to apples and bananas in this study of fruitful living.
Fruitful living, leaving a fruitful legacy. Let's just remind ourselves, what is the fruit of the Spirit?
It's a cluster of qualities of what God develops in us through His Spirit,
in order to reflect Him to the world.
Yeah, and it seems to always have a social corporate component to it. Like the fruit are emanating for us. Other people can see it if it's there or if it's not there.
Right. The purpose of the fruit of the Spirit, we talked about that, and it was a very interesting conversation. We talked about that it really attracts other people, these qualities of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. In our personality, those qualities of God, when other people see it, they want God. God becomes uniquely attractive to them because they see Him physically. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we've covered a big number of the fruit. Just to review, love is what? How do we define that? And I also encouraged us to match a physical fruit with the spiritual fruit as a kind of a memory device to help us remember what it is. And mainly these qualities are being qualities, not necessarily doing qualities, although they are expressed in our actions. So how do we define love?
as a grape.
Why a grape?
Done.
Love is grape. That's all we need to say.
I think the way you pictured it for us, Lisa, was that love manifests itself in dealing with difficult people.
It's commitment to be with people in all things.
Yeah, and you led us to the most famous passage on love, which is 1 Corinthians 13. It talked about the patience and kindness, ding, 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 other fruit that are kind of embodied in love.
Good. Joy, we use the fruit of a cherry, a sweet fruit, but it has a pit in the middle. And why is that a memory device for joy?
Because it has to do with how we respond to difficult circumstances as a reflection of our trust in God.
Good. Okay, peace.
With peace, focused on just even in the midst of life, in the troubles of life, how Christ offers us peace, even in the midst of storms, the type, that are happening. So it's definitely in a context of difficulty and challenge.
A resting in God, and we paired it with a blueberry, which is a very healthy fruit that helps with stress physically. And then after that, patience.
That's me. I'm a coconut.
We picked the coconut, which is a tough outside, but a sweet inner fruit, kind of the opposite of a cherry. But it's really hanging in with people and their problems.
Long suffering.
And then the last 2 we did were kindness and goodness. For kindness, we picked the pineapple
Right.
because it really has to do with compassion and action. And pineapple's long been a symbol of hospitality. And then goodness is really being like God inside and out. And only God is good. So he's the only one who can grow that quality in us. And we picked the strawberry because it wears its seed on the outside. Okay, so let's go on now. We're going to cover two more in this conversation, faithfulness and gentleness. And these are both kind of clunky. I think they're a little bit difficult to understand. Russell, would you read 2 Timothy 2, verses 11 to 13? And we're going to look first at faithfulness.
Here is a trustworthy saying. If we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself.
Okay, as we get into faithfulness, I want to differentiate just a little bit between faith and faithfulness.
Which the root of the word faithfulness is in Greek pistis, or faith. But instead of like trusting in, as you would think of just the word faith, faithfulness is like you've trusted in so much that it's like overflowing out of you.
I love
this
that.
dependence or this leaning on God.
It carries with it the idea of being trustworthy and reliable. And when we think about the faithfulness of God, his mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. He is the ultimate person in the universe that we can rely on, that we can trust in, that we can depend upon, and know that he won't let us down.
That's so good. Faith is trusting in God, but faithfulness is being somebody worthy to be trusted.
Yeah.
That's what Timothy is about. Even if we are faithless, he will remain faithful. He's worthy to be trusted. And that's the quality that he wants to reproduce in us. As we have faith in him, he will make us have that quality as well, that others can trust us. I picked the fruit of an apple for that, which is maybe a little weird, but I was thinking about the shiny skin and how it mirrors. And that's really the only way we can exhibit faithfulness, is to mirror God's faithfulness to us. We mirror that back to others.
I'm kind of curious because, Daniel, something you said got me wondering. You mentioned the contrast between faith of us trusting God versus faithfulness. Is there a relationship that we can infer that the more I am trusting God, the more faithful I'll be?
Yeah, I think so, because it's the same root word in both.
Right.
Even trust and faith. I think we struggle sometime with the word faith, especially in our culture, because we think like, if I just believe harder, I'll get my mind around who God is and what he's trying to do. And if I can just convince someone, then they'll have faith and believe. I think one of the best metaphors is sitting on a chair and trusting it's going to hold you, right? It's a trust. And the more we lean into that kind of faith, I think it just naturally starts to flow out of us in the way that we're trustworthy for others and kind of reflect, the apple metaphor of reflect God back toward God and toward others.
Right.
Yeah. I think one other element of faithfulness that is a kind of a derivative thing, and maybe be one way that it expresses faithfulness, is consistency.
That's good.
And that level of consistency is part of what contributes to being trustworthy. Somebody who's inconsistent all the time, you don't feel like you can trust them to follow
There's
through.
Stability. Yeah, faithfulness, I guess, to boil it down, is to be true to God. And I think it's only something he produces. And Daniel, to use your chair metaphor, when we sit on God as if on a chair, we're trusting him. It's that kind of a thing. Let's move to the next one of gentleness. This is a beautiful fruit, but I think it's difficult to understand. The Greek word in Galatians 5 conveys the idea of gentleness of attitude and behavior, kind of in contrast to harshness in dealing with other people. Some of the synonyms are meekness or mildness or endurance. And, it's interesting that in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus actually describes himself as being gentle and humble.
And that's the only time he self-describes.
Wow.
He uses the word gentle, which in our culture is a sign of weakness. Gentleness is viewed as being weak, and that's not at all what the word means. The word does not mean weak. It pictures a strength that's channeled for the appropriate purpose.
That's good.
Or a humility.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
like
right.
another way to say that.
And, when we look at Philippians 2, where Jesus lays down his power, there's a kind of a gentleness and being obedient even to death on the cross. Centuries ago, Aristotle described this word as the golden mean between extreme anger and extreme angerlessness. And in ancient Greece, war horses were trained to be meek, or gentle, strong and powerful, and yet under control and willing to submit. And in that way, kind of to echo what you just said, Bill, gentleness is like a harnessed power. It's a bent will. It still has great power and great strength, but it's yielded and yielded specifically to God. And just for a second, Russell, grab 1 Thessalonians 2, 7 to 8. And this is Paul writing to the Thessalonians. What does he say?
Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well.
In the NCVs, he says, we were very gentle with you, like a mother caring for her children. That's a yielded posture to accomplish good. For gentleness, I chose a banana because it's got a really sensitive skin, but it's got a powerful fruit within. It is this yieldedness. I think it's one of the most counterintuitive spiritual fruit there is. It's very interesting to think about.
One of the things that your description is helping me grasp with gentleness is that there's a certain strength implied in gentleness that is under control and that is being is yielding itself for someone else. You understand someone's being gentle when they have the ability to be destructive to something, but you're like, hey, be gentle with that. You know, this model, this vase that is very expensive because you have the power to crush it, but control that and use that to support this other thing.
And how holy our God is, and that he's exactly that way.
Exactly.
You know, he could just unleash his justice on us, but instead he holds himself back and deals with us gently. You know, when we layer up these qualities, I mean, thinking about them all, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, they all have this double-edgedness to them. And they're so beautiful when that tension is held and yielded in gentleness to the character of God and what he wants to accomplish in our world through our character. We have one more to look at, and we will in our next conversation. When we were on the spiritual fruit of patience, we talked about what's the hardest one to grow, you know, for us to cooperate with God in. But when I did a little kind of anecdotal study with social media, self-control was the overwhelmingly most difficult to grow.
I just wonder if some of that's because we live in a culture of plenty. So it's so easy to overdo everything because there's so many options available to us. I just wonder.
Yeah, so it's like the soil we grow in is ridiculous.
I remember when I was pastoring, part of our mission outreach was building churches in the Ukraine, the particular region of southwest Ukraine. And at one point, we brought a couple of the Ukrainian pastors over to interact with our people and to get to know them and everything. And if I'm remembering correctly, one of the host families, I'm going to put it this way, made the mistake of taking them to the grocery store. They just about lost their minds.
Not bad.
Just the number of options.
Just the number. I mean, you know, when you have 40 different kinds of loaves of bread, and they get a loaf of bread if they make it themselves at home when they can get flour.
And it might not even be a loaf. It might be just a little roll.
Yeah, there's something about living in a land of plenty that kind of stimulates a lack of self-control, I think.
And for sure, that's our context, you know, whether it's money, clothes, and possessions, and etc. But self-control is about more than possessions. You know, I think about controlling our emotions, anger, controlling our view of ourselves, narcissism. You know, what are we doing with our thought life and such? Self-control is mysterious. And I can see why we report having so much trouble with it in our very unpredictable world. And in Galatians 5, Paul lists this as the last fruit of the Spirit. And it comes from two roots. One meaning to rein in or curb, kind of like put boundaries around, okay? The other meaning to heal or save or make whole. And they apply specifically to our sensitive nature, our understanding, our mind. And so just to kind of coin a phrase from all of that information, I'm just going to suggest that we might define self-control as to be healthy-minded. And I think about Paul's words, to have a sane estimate of ourselves from Romans 12.
And in that context, I really like the idea of boundaries, because when we operate without boundaries, it's easy to do or feel almost anything to excess.
Mm-hmm.
But when there are appropriate boundaries in place, it protects us from that inclination, I think.
As you were describing, I was thinking of these two words. What do you think the difference is between self-control and something like self-regulation? Or are they connected, do you think?
How do you define those two things? Because maybe regulation is a way to control.
Mm-hmm. That's what I'm just wondering out loud.
Self-control feels a little more organic, and self-regulated feels a little bit more
external,
procedural.
Maybe regulation is a way you control. You mentioned the word boundaries. I mentioned the word boundaries. There's a proverb that I have gone to many times, and it's really helped me make this concept of self-control, because that's the word, more concrete. And it's Proverbs 25:28.
Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control.
Flesh that out. This is ancient times.
Yeah, so I love this verse because, you think about a city with broken down walls. Nehemiah, when he gets the news that Jerusalem's walls are broken down, and he weeps and prays and calls out to God, because that was their sense of protection. It was almost like, if you can imagine, having a door to your house missing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And just all the danger that would...
it creates vulnerability.
Right. For anything to come in and out. And so that's what a wall meant in ancient times: protection, which allowed for flourishing, which allowed for safety. And so the writer here is saying that a person without self-control is like a city whose walls have been broken down. No regulation, no protection even.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about all the ways that it manifests itself in Proverbs, like in Proverbs 6 and 7 with the adulterous woman. And there's a trap that's being set with this young man that he can't see because he doesn't have self-control. Or the ant, consider the ant, oh sluggard. Mm-hmm. Poverty will jump on you if you don't have the self-control to get out of bed in the morning. Mm-hmm. So you see these ways in which our lives can be broken down if we don't have these boundaries and these rhythms that are meant to help us be healthy.
Yeah.
As I'm listening to you guys talk, I'm thinking, in the world that I feel probably I have more vulnerability, and that's food. What boundaries do is they help us stay in a safe place. Mm-hmm. And left to myself, bring me a dozen Big Macs, I'm good to go. Mm-hmm. Left to myself, I can eat a whole pan of brownies and not even come up for air.
Yeah.
But now that there have been some boundaries imposed, I'm in a safer, less vulnerable place, to use the idea you were using, Rasul.
Yeah, and I think, too, the key is the word after the self in both of those, like regulation and control, right? Mm-hmm. Like regulations, like rules and regulations, are things, levers you put in place to prevent certain things from happening. So ensure control is, do you have the ability to consistently hold to those regulations? So I think regulations are the means, but the self-control is the ultimate characteristic that allows you to be able to self-regulate.
I chose an orange for self-control because it symbolizes health and this healthy mindedness of it. I'm struck, though, in our conversation, and again, we've talked about, do these fruit kind of accumulate one on top of another, but our last one we looked at was gentleness, and it's this yieldedness to God. Self-control is the fruit that has the word self in it, and we've been really clear that we can't grow these fruit by ourselves. God grows the fruit in us.
There's irony there.
There's great irony in it. And I think the understanding of self-control is that we are involved in it, but we don't produce it. That's a good and bad thing. And that's why I go back to Romans. In fact, Rasul, would you grab Romans 12? Yep. Actually, let's do it together, you and Daniel. Read verses 1 through 3.
Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will.
For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned.
Yeah, as I was listening to Rasul reading verses 1 and 2, I listened to Daniel too, but I was thinking about something particular. I was thinking Romans 12 verses 1 and 2 could almost be a summary statement for everything we've talked about in these 2 weeks of conversations on the fruit of the Spirit, because do not conform to the pattern of this world lines up with the works of the flesh.
Right. Good.
And it's something we do as an expression of our fallen, broken nature, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind is something that happens to us. Conform is active, be transformed is passive. And that's what the Holy Spirit does when He's producing His fruit in our lives. And so it just seems like in that statement in Romans 12:2 that Rasul read, that we're seeing kind of a summary statement for the fruit of the Spirit.
And then I also think that there's this mystical yet very real participation we have in what the Spirit is doing, because obviously in Romans 12:1 and 2, Paul is saying, be transformed. It's a command. And it reminded me of Psalm 131, where we read, "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me." When you were talking about that process. And then the last verse says, "O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore." And I think you see the tension of those things. Like, I have quieted my soul, self-control, by hoping in the Lord, the one who gives me the ability to have that self-control.
A few months back, the first tornado ravaged through my neighborhood in the history of our neighborhood in Colorado. Very bizarre, very wooded place. And 17,000 trees were uprooted and fences were broken over. It's such a metaphor to live in a neighborhood like that, where you see the fences broken down and the trees down. You can look right straight into people's backyards, and it's just also exposed. And there is this partnership of cooperation, us cooperating as God put parameters around us. But there's a real reality, too, of us asking, just simply asking for the control that we lack. It brings me such peace. It's not all up to me to self-regulate. I can ask Him to grow this fruit of self-control in me. And it's a great relief in knowing that He will do so.
Yeah, characteristic number 9 in that list in Galatians 5 of the fruit of the Spirit, self-control. And it truly is a relief to know that we really aren't meant to do any of these, including self-control, on our own. This truly is the fruit of the Spirit. Is evidence that God is at work in our life when love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control characterize how we're living. But, saying that begs the question, do I have any part in displaying this fruit? We're saying it's God at work, but do I have a role at all? Do I put forth any effort? Well, that question and more still ahead in this second part of our study called Fruitful Living here on Discover the Word. But before we keep moving forward, let me take just a moment to mention again another study that we did together that would really complement what we're doing. And that study is called It's All About Grace. It's an extended study of the whole book, the whole letter of Galatians. 6 parts, taking one chapter in each part and putting into context all Paul wrote to those first century Galatian churches. And I just think it would be a really solid foundation under what we're studying now in Galatians chapter 5 about the fruit of the Spirit. You can find that study on our website in the archive section by clicking Archive when you go to discovertheword.org. And then in the search bar, type Galatians or It's All About Grace, and that study will come up. And while I'm at it, can I also recommend another study that we did? It was a 2-episode conversation about letter writing in the first century with our friend Randy Richards. Amazing insight into Paul, the letter writer. Type that title, Paul the Letter Writer, into the search in our archive, and you'll find that one there too at discovertheword.org. All right, so when it comes to buying fresh produce, there's a lot to think about, isn't there? Because we've all had the experience of getting home with a watermelon or a bag of apples or some grapes, and they're not good. Disappointing, to say the least. And so do you have any tricks for inspecting fruit in the store? What are some things you look for, some things you do as a fruit inspector? Well, in this next part of the study of fruitful living, they're going to talk about fruit inspection. We inspect the fruit that we intend to eat, and so how do we inspect the spiritual fruit that's growing in our lives? Can we? Should we? And should we be concerned with inspecting the quality of the spiritual fruit that we perceive to be growing or not growing in other people's lives? Well, those are the kinds of questions that we'll be addressing in this next part of the conversation that we're going to call fruit inspection.
Do you know how to pick out ripe fruit when you go to the grocery store? And maybe not all of them.
With some of them, you thump it on the outside.
Which one?
Like melons,
Okay.
cantaloupe, watermelons.
Okay. Well, avocado,
Sure.
Squeeze a little bit, see if it's ripe.
Yep. Firm or a little bit, tiny bit smushy.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Tiny.
Yep. Sometimes you'll use your sense of smell, right? With a cantaloupe.
Totally
or-
with a cantaloupe.
or
Rocky
a
Ford.
pineapple.
What do you do with pineapple?
I have always looked first for the color.
Yes.
Because if it has a lot of green,
Uh-huh.
that's not a good sign. And then I smell it, and then also it should feel just barely soft.
Good. And I don't know, my mom taught me to take one leaf out of the top. If it comes out smoothly like a toothpick, it's ripe.
I've never heard that
I
one.
know. Isn't this
Yeah.
fun? And apples, you want to kind of touch them and see if they're mushy or not. I mean, we can go on and on, right? That's how we pick our fruit. That's how we evaluate it. How do we evaluate the fruit of the Spirit in our lives? Let's not evaluate everybody else's fruit, because that is our tendency, is it not? Let me evaluate your fruit, Rasul. Let me evaluate your fruit, Bill. But, maybe we want to spend a few minutes evaluating our own fruit. How do we know that we're growing healthy fruit?
I think one thing, again, trees don't eat their own fruit. Like, other people eat the trees' fruit. And so how are other people experiencing you? Do they experience you as a loving person? Do they experience you as a self-controlled person? I think you can get some inspectors to give you some feedback if you so dare.
That's scary.
I think what I was leaning into as you started that, Rasul, was having a genuine accountability partner, somebody who cares about you enough to be honest with you, but loves you enough to not be harsh with you and has that balance. And so having someone that can be utterly and completely honest with you about all the frailties and flaws that we don't see ourselves.
How do you get somebody like that?
I married her.
Yeah.
I knew where you were going with that.
Yeah. And, I think that's really valid. But the person we're married to can grow very immune to us and not see our flaws or...
Well, we're 47 years in, and that hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, pastoring a church that's 80% single and a lot of folks in their 20s and 30s, like we have seen the power and the beauty of friendship in the context of accountability,
That's
in
good.
the context of people just doing life with each other. And I think that's just intentional community. And especially, I think, post-pandemic, where our rhythms got interrupted, where it seems for some harder to make the intentional step to get with people, and then even harder still to be real enough to say, hey, let's get beyond the sports talk, let's get beyond the pop culture, and let's get into how are you doing, where are you at?
And I think communal is an important word there. Community, communal, for all of this, both the way that we live out the fruit, but then also in the how are we doing with the fruit. And even if we don't have a lot of people around us, maybe the nurse who takes care of you or whatever might be the only person you interact with, but how do they receive you? How do you treat them? Those types of things. And so it is a very communal thing, community.
The performance reviews
Yeah.
are a way to get feedback. We may not like them, in our occupations. And sometimes we have really unjust and poor supervisors, and that makes it very difficult. But in general, that's a place we can look to measure how are we doing. I also think about, it's kind of a sweet thing. I think back to elementary school. In my upbringing, we didn't have grades at first. We had like S, and in and you. And S meant satisfactory, and in meant needs improvement, and you meant unsatisfactory. But it was about our character. It was about gets along with other people, is respectful, those kinds of things. And I love that looking back on it, because that was a true measurement of the character that was growing as a kid. I loved that. Jesus talks about a couple of ways to evaluate fruit. So does James. Bill, would you grab Matthew 7:15-20, and let's see what Jesus is talking about in terms of not good fruit and good fruit that helps inform us.
Yeah, and the first part of this was a verse that you cited for us in an earlier conversation.
Thank you. Go ahead and include that then.
Yeah, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them.
Who is it we're going to recognize?
The false teachers in that context.
Or the good, right? Just by the fruit. I think about another place where Jesus talks very clearly about what is produced, and that's in John 15. And he talks about it's when we abide that we will bear fruit. And that's good fruit as well. So maybe as we think about this, we think about our lives and how to measure fruit. There is an example of, are we bearing good or bad fruit? James also talks about fruit. James 3:17.
But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness.
Now, I know he mentions full of mercy and good fruit, but I read Galatians 5 and I see the fruit of the Spirit, which is what we've obviously been talking about. I read James 3 and I see the fruit of wisdom that's from above. And in both cases, something's happening on the inside that gets manifested and visible on the outside.
A lot of James' letter is about our behavior. It's about doing, not just believing, but expressing our
what
belief.
faith looks like when we live it out.
In action. So that is absolutely right. And they go in tandem, the inner characteristic that is exhibited in our outer choices and actions. One commentator said about Matthew that fruit is not a work, something external and maybe dissociated from its source, but it's a product that corresponds to the nature of where it's growing. So I think maybe there's two things we can look at in evaluating our fruit inspection, and one is the quality. And we see that in both of these passages. James' passage reads almost like another version of Paul's list in Galatians 5. It is wisdom from above, and it's the only place it can come from. In initiating Jesus' ministry, John the Baptist exhorted, and this is in Matthew 3:8, produce fruit in keeping with repentance. What does that mean?
Well, again, repentance is something that happens on the inside that ends up producing a manifestation on the outside.
Right. Okay, so the quality. And then I think maybe another way to evaluate our fruit is the quantity. And we talked about, are we going to exhibit all 9 of these fruit all the time in our lives? Is it important to grow sometime and others at the other time? Do you know? Can you put your finger on that? Do we know anything from Scripture about that? The quantity of the fruit?
Yeah, I was thinking about too, just it's really hard for us to get a feel for where we're doing well when it comes to the fruit of the Spirit. So when we talk about quantity, I think that gets even trickier because it's like, well, how loving am I? Because I think one of the signs of maturity is recognizing how less loving I was than I ever thought I was, or how impatient I am versus how patient I thought I was, or how not gentle I am versus how gentle I thought I was. And so there's almost an awareness that comes with growing up in our faith.
Yeah, in this fruit inspection concept, when we think about a farmer, there's this ongoing process of adjustments and evaluations about how is my crop doing. That doesn't just happen when it's harvest time, right? Like it happens every step along the way, that you're looking out. You're seeing if birds are coming by and that's thinking, do I need to put a scarecrow up? You're seeing if some patch doesn't seem to be growing in the same way. Does it need more care, some watering, some fertilizing? And we see these pictures throughout the Gospels. And so I think there's an aspect of that seems to suggest an ongoing evaluative process that has these minor adjustments and tweaks that includes all the things. So some of it is a self-reflection. Some of it is inviting accountability and some of it is the spiritual aspect of God, show me where I need to change, where my fruit isn't sweet.
I want to close with a verse that we just touched on in one of our past conversations from Romans 12:3. And I think this is the nut for us. Do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. And that's, to me, it's a call to self-examination. It's a call to be in a relationship in such a way that I see how far away I am and what that means about me, or I see how close I am and what that means about me, that we are in a yielded relationship to continually depend upon the vine to grow us and to examine how are we doing.
A helpful part of our conversation about fruitful living and the fruit of the Spirit concerning fruit inspection, accountability, and awareness, two very important things when, quote, inspecting the fruit of the Spirit as we see it in our own lives. And also a good caution about being overly concerned about inspecting and evaluating the fruit in other people's lives. Well, let me take just a moment here to say thanks to all the Discover the Word group members who partner with us financially to make it possible for Our Daily Bread Ministries to continue to make the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible accessible and understandable to people all around the world. Now, Discover the Word is one of the aspects of the ministry, but we help people engage the Scriptures with our Daily Bread devotional and a host of other printed materials, with video and online resources and other audio podcasts. And so if you'd like to give and be part of our mission, just go to our discovertheword.org website and click Donate there. That's discovertheword.org. Click Donate. All right, so in the next segment now, we're going to get into a discussion about a question that may have been in the back of your mind from all the conversations we've been having about the fruit of the Spirit and fruitful living. Now, we've said repeatedly that this is not us necessarily trying harder, being more disciplined, reaching down and just by our own willpower making the fruit of the Spirit grow in our lives. It's not about us. And so does that mean that we're 100% spectators, that we don't have to put forth any effort at all? We have zero role in this? Well, that's what the group will be focusing on as we sit back down at the table with them.
Can you share about a season in your life that was just super fruitful? Everything happening and popping and growing and wonderful and just fruit everywhere you turned.
I've been really enjoying watching my kids grow up in the last few years in particular. It's been fun all the way through, and I really miss, in some ways, the stages where I would just hold them and that would be quality time. But as I watch my almost 2 teenagers now and my daughter, who's well on her way to becoming one, doing gymnastics or playing basketball or those types of things, it's just so fun to watch them becoming like people.
Yeah, I think in a ministry context, there was a season where I was leading music ministry, and it was just clicking on all cylinders, seeing people grow spiritually, seeing people come to faith. My wife and I were leading together. You know, our daughter was loving and being involved and around it, and it was just a really dynamic time of growth and growing my leadership and just seeing impact into the world.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Those are just such full moments. And we're actually not including anything negative in them, but you can have really fruitful times even with negative things. I'm thinking about when my father died and I was leading MOPS, this organization, and I was very depleted, and yet I watched God continue to provide for me even when I was depleted. And I had this sense of abundance that even though I was on fumes, he wasn't. And he showed up day after day and helped me. And these seasons of abundance, when we look at them in life, they're so rich and so rewarding. I want to take a few minutes in this conversation to think about how do we grow fruit in all seasons, because not every season feels abundant. And I'm going to think about specifically, I think I probably used this illustration before, but when I was in kindergarten, our teacher passed out these small Dixie cups to us all, and she troweled little bits of potting soil into each cup, and then she came and handed us each some marigold seeds. and told us to punch them down into the cup, and then we'd each dribble a little water, and we carried them home very carefully. And I remember pulling a kitchen chair over to the window above the sink and putting my little Dixie cup garden, on that windowsill. And every day I'd run and get that chair and climb up there and see if my seed was growing. And I could never see anything. It just looked like mud in a cup. And I was so discouraged. And I remember one day I asked my mom, I said, can I just dig up that seed to see what's happening? And she was like, well, yeah, you can. But if you do, it's going to stop growing. And the principle is that seeds grow in the dark, in the mud, over a long period of time. And that is really hard. So can we talk for a few minutes about how we grow fruit in every season, in the seasons of abundance where the harvest has come in and we're going to take in the fruit off the orchards, and the seasons when we always see is dirt in a cup?
Well, I think the first thing is always keeping in mind that we don't grow the fruit. The Spirit grows the fruit in us, because the tree doesn't grunt and groan and say, I'm going to make an apple or whatever. That's just not what happens.
Yeah.
Like you said, there's a process. It takes time. And there are a lot of forces at work that make that happen. And in the fruit of the Spirit, how can we grow fruit? We can't.
Right.
We can put ourselves in a posture where the Lord can grow fruit in us. And that kind of yieldedness is our contribution.
Good. Let's turn to Scripture and see that played out. I think those principles we've all extrapolated. Daniel, would you get Psalm 1, 1 to 3? And then, Rasul, could you grab Jeremiah 17, 7 to 8? And then we'll also look at John 15 in a minute. But let's remember, as we're reading these, there's two roles, and you just said it, Bill. God's job is to grow it. But what role do we have in the process?
Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers.
Okay, let's go ahead and read Jeremiah 17 too, and then we'll try and pull out.
Yep, Jeremiah 17, 7 and 8. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water, that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in the year of drought, and never fails to bear fruit.
First thing I want to point out is that both in Psalm 1 and in Jeremiah, so Psalm 1, verse 3, it will yield its fruit in season. Whatever they do prospers. And then in Jeremiah, it has no worries in the fear of drought. It never fails to bear fruit. Its leaves are always green. So there is a production in every season. And that just seems to be what the tree was made to do, right?
But it only does it if it's planted by the waters and can draw the sustenance. For those who've been to the Middle East, it's mostly a very dry, arid climate. And even in the more northern parts of Israel, the greenest areas are those that are around the rivers. You see a lot of yellows and browns and other things, but around the waters, that's where the things are the greenest.
So our role, if we're going to look at that, God's role is to develop the fruit, but our role is to stay by the stream, plant by the water, send our roots down deep. And what does it look like practically?
Yeah, I kind of struggle with that, because when I read it prospers whatever it does, but then I'm like, it yields its fruit in season. Does that mean that I should be expected to be as productive all the time? I don't feel like I am.
And it almost says the opposite of that, right? So if the season of fruit is a few months, does that mean the rest of the year is a growing time, or a like staying connected to, in this passage, delighting in the law of the Lord, meditating on the law day and night, sending the roots down deep? The growth of the fruit is outside of our hands anyway.
I think that's exactly it. And, if we look back at those verses, there are some things we're not to do. There's some things that get in the way of fruit production. What do you see in Psalm 1?
Walk in the step with the wicked, stand in the way of sinners, sit in the company of mockers.
Yeah, how do we do that again? I mean, some of these words don't mean much.
Well, there's actually a kind of a negative progression that takes place there. You start off by walking, and then you stop, and you're just there present, and then you sit down and stay a while.
And you hunker down.
Yeah, in that atmosphere, in that environment. And it's kind of like this negative progression away from the things of God and toward the things of faithlessness and cynicism and doubt.
It can be as simple as, you know what, I'm tired of going to church. I'm done. That kind of thing. And you just give up, and I'm going to watch football instead. And that's not a legal thing, but it's like if you aren't surrounding yourself with believers, you kind of hunker down with unbelievers.
Both of these passages points to the importance of our environment in terms of our spiritual status and growth. And I think sometimes living in an individualistic culture, we can underestimate the significance of our associations with people, even just being like, I know, and I always notice this when I travel, like it's easier for me to work out when there's a gym in the hotel than when I'm at home and I don't have a membership.
Yeah.
Same motivation in both places, but just the facility and the access and the environment makes it easier for me to do that. And so in the same way, what am I doing to cultivate the space around me to create a greenhouse effect so that I can bear fruit?
So choosing our environment is crucial.
Yeah.
I see in Jeremiah 17 a couple of things too. What do you see in verse 8? There are a couple of things that can get in the way.
Fear
It does not fear when heat comes.
and worries.
And no worries in a year of drought. And, that just sounds like buck up. But it really is those qualities that we looked at in the list from Galatians 5, the peace, the joy, the confidence in God despite our circumstances. So as we put this together, and then I want us to end with John 15, 1 through 8, there's some things we can do to cooperate with the gardener, with the orchard keeper, if you will, with God. It's our job to stay attached to him, and it's his job to grow. We need to pay attention to our environment. We need to pay attention to what kind of fruit we're growing, as we looked at in our last conversation. But let's hear, too, about how Jesus describes the fruit growing process in John 15. And let's just go around and read these verses as we close this conversation.
Okay, I'll start us off. John 15, verse 1, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you.
Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing.
If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples.
And I think that was a great way to close out that part of our conversation about fruitful living here on Discover the Word by reading that section of Jesus' words in John 15. Important discussion about the fruit growing process and understanding roles and how it works. And so, do you remember how we started this study back at the beginning of part 1? Elisa asked us about the legacy that we'll leave and how our legacy is really more about being than doing. Well, we're going to circle back to that idea to close this discussion about the fruit of the Spirit, because it's really kind of a sobering thought. But the reality is that after you die, you will be, for the most part, totally forgotten after 3 or at the most 4 generations. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule. Those who had a level of fame or notoriety may be written about or discussed for longer, but most of the generations to come will have no idea of our accomplishments or our failures, of our personalities, what we were like, and how we lived our life. But just because they won't remember your name or anything about you, does that mean that you and your life will have no effect on those future generations? Well, as we conclude these conversations about fruitful living, I think we'll discover why, when the fruit of the Spirit does characterize our life, not only does it make our life better now, but it also leaves a legacy that will have an impact on future generations, even if they don't remember our name or anything about us. And we'll have that conversation after we take a moment to look ahead to our next study on Discover the Word, one that Rasul will be leading. Next time on the Discover the Word podcast, Rasul will tell us a story about a time when he ran into Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal, the huge, imposing, intimidating basketball player, in a surprising place.
I was invited to Hamilton, the musical. Somebody from my church was actually in the musical. So
cool.
During the intermission, there's a long line. And so I'm in this line and we turn the corner and then I bump into this like very solid material and I look and I'm like, why is there a wall this narrow in this big theater? And so I look over and I'm like, oh, and my neck just keeps craning upwards. And then finally I see it's Shaquille O'Neal that I bumped into. And he's, I'm looking all the way up. He's looking down at me to see what bumped into him. Oh. But for me, there was a feel of dread because I had never been next to a person that big before. And it was super intimidating.
Yeah, and so see how that story fits into a study called What's in a Name? About how there seems to be a name for God in the Bible that can help us understand that He's with us and He's for us, no matter what. What's in a Name? On the next Discover the Word podcast. And now, this idea of how long we'll be remembered. That's where Elisa wants to take us in this last part of our conversation about fruitful living.
Can you name your great-grandmother or grandfather?
Mary Bond, I think, was my great-grandmother on my mom's side.
Okay.
And there were some Overtons in there somewhere because my mom's middle name was Overton, and that was a family name.
So you got their last name on those?
Yeah.
Okay. Daniel?
I didn't know him, but my grandfather was Roy Aldrich Jr., so I'm going to go with Roy Aldrich.
And Russell?
Growing up, had no idea. Then I did Ancestry, and my mother's maiden name was Whitehead.
Okay.
And so her mother's name was Ann Whitehead.
Okay. Yeah, and see, all I got is Grandmother Daisy.
Got it.
That's all I got. Okay, now go great-great-grandmother, grandfather.
Yeah, there were some Bonds and Overtons
Maybe.
and Johnsons, but my mom had her grandmother's name as a middle name, and my grandmother had her mother's last name, maiden name, as her middle name. My grandmother's Mary Bond Johnson.
We've got some of those in our family, too. The report is that we're remembered maybe for 3 generations, unless fame or fable carries on a longer reputation. That's sobering. And if you look at all of the people who've lived on this face of this planet over all the eons, that it's existed, we are just a little speck of dust. We're hardly here. We care a lot, though, about making a difference during life that we do have. We really do care about that. And, when we began this conversation about the fruit of the Spirit and having a fruitful life, we talked about, you might measure that through our children or through our work. But honestly, we're going to measure that most through our character. And the character specifically that is the fruit of the Spirit that God grows in us as we cooperate with Him. That's powerful. Because as we impact others around us, they live next to us, and then the next generation lives next to them. That's growing a life that matters.
Yeah. When you say that we will only be remembered for 3 generations, that really kind of hits me because my granddaughter is expecting my first great-grandchild. And so according to that standard, if that great-grandchild remembers me at all, that'll be the last generation that does.
And maybe because we're living so much longer, maybe it'll change to 4. But still, that's a speck of influence, isn't it? But our character remains in the investments we make. And as we draw this conversation on fruitful living to a close, I want us to look at a couple of Psalms and a couple of places in Scripture where we see this legacy piece played out. Russell and Daniel, y'all are on the younger side of life. You probably don't think all the time about older age, but Bill and I do.
We're in our sunset years.
or at least, we may be over those into the black. I don't know. But anyway, we are there. And I love how the psalmists include birth to death, and all the whole strata of life. Bill, would you read Psalm 71, 17 to 18.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me to read that because I've actually preached on this text many times. And I always start by saying many times in your Bible, the publisher will put a little heading over a psalm as to kind of what the big idea it is. And in my Bible, the heading said, The Song of an Old Man. So I usually tell them that and say, I feel eminently qualified to read this to you because I'm that. He says, Since my youth, God, you have taught me, and to this day I declare your marvelous deeds. Even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, my God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come. And the next verse, verse 19 says, here's the things I want this next coming generation to know about God.
Yeah, go ahead.
Your righteousness is exalted beyond the heavens. You who have done great things, O God, who is like you.
Mm.
I just think that is one of the greatest compact theologies found anywhere in the Old Testament, Psalm 71:19. The psalmist says, this is what I want to hand off to the next generation.
And that's out of a legacy of God asking the people to pass on to their children over and over and over again. This is what makes us God's special people. We've been given this gift of this instruction called the Torah, and this is how we live our lives, and this is why, because God rescued us out of Egypt. And so we also should be a rescuing people for those who are vulnerable and those types of things. So as a memory and a passing on to the next generation.
Way back from Deuteronomy, yeah.
And I see a New Testament parallel in that. Paul, in the sunset years of his ministry in 2 Timothy chapter 2 writes, you then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, and trust to faithful men who will be able to teach with others.
That's 4 generations in there.
There
Right.
is.
Yeah.
You almost picture these links of chains, that go all the way back to the beginning of time and all the way forward. And we can think, we are just, a breath and we're gone. But the reality is that our legacy of fruitfulness is the connection to the chains that follow us from the chains that precede us. That beautiful connection, use a thread of pearls if you wanted to, but that analogy that it's not just about us, it's about us connecting to what came before us and then to what will come after us.
Yeah, it's almost tricky to use the phrase our legacy in that sense, because even in all the examples that we're giving, what's being passed down isn't what I think or what I did. This is what God's done.
It's the character of God.
This is what God did for me. This is what God can do for you. And so it's a passing on of God's legacy from one generation to the next.
Which is really the big pop, Daniel, of the whole conversations we've been having. The fruitful living is about God producing his fruit in us, his characteristics and our personality, so that other people see him. And if we do that generation to generation to generation to generation to generation, that's how people come to know about God. James writes about it similarly. We've looked at it in other conversations, but let's read it again here. James 3:13-18. This is the wisdom that comes from above that looks a whole lot like the fruit of the Spirit.
James 3:13-18. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere.
That's what we want to be looking like. Let's end with this little cherry on the top. Daniel, would you read 1 John 3:2, because this is the end product of God growing his fruit in us.
We know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is.
So what we've been really talking about it without using the language of theology is the doctrine of sanctification, right? The process where God takes us as a new baby in Christ and grows us to be more and more like him. And then when we see him face to face, that work will be ultimately and finally completed.
That's beautifully said. I did a little writing that I wanted us to close with that summarizes each of the fruit. I think we'll hear in it God's work and our cooperation with God's work. But if we could just go around and read, it's going to touch on each of the 9 fruit. And to summarize, the fruit of the Spirit is God's characteristics expressed in our unique personalities. It's the external result of an internal relationship. It's God's job to grow in us, and it's our job to cooperate with his growing efforts. But let's go down, because there is a matter of choice in each one of this. We choose to cooperate, and so this is our part. But I'm going to start, and let's just go through the list of each fruit with this language that I've written. I will love. I will make a committed choice to be there in everything, even when it's hard to love people. That's love.
I will joy. I will have confidence in God no matter what happens.
I will practice peace. I will rest in God, knowing that God holds me in the storms of life.
And of course, I get this one. I will reach for patience, the coconut. I will hang in with people and their problems.
I will express kindness, the pineapple. I will meet needs with compassion.
I will model goodness. I will be like God inside and out.
I will keep faithfulness. I will be true to God.
I will live gentleness. I will yield myself to God's desires.
I will choose self-control. I will depend on healthy-minded thinking for all the areas of my life.
Yeah, the fruit of the Spirit. I hope these conversations have been encouraging and at the same time challenging and motivating. The fruit of the Spirit is God's characteristics expressed in our personalities. It's the external result of an internal relationship. Fruitful living. Thanks, Elisa, for taking Bill and Daniel and Rasul and, of course, the rest of us on this journey through how when love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control characterize us. Well, that's the fruit of the Spirit. And I think those physical fruit pairings were helpful too. And I also think it would be great to have Elisa close this study with a word of prayer. And so we'll have her come back and do that in just a moment. But first, just a quick heads up that Elisa has a book on this passage and this topic that will be coming out early next year in 2025. It's being published by our Daily Bread publishing group, and there are still some steps in the publication process to go, but I just wanted you to file that away in your mind that it's coming, and we'll give you more info and give you a specific release date as the time comes closer. But I think you'll want to get a copy of Elisa's upcoming book on fruitful living when it's available early next year. All right, and now here is Elisa to close this study about fruitful living with a word of prayer.
God, you are the good grower. We know that this fruitful life that we desire is not all up to us. It's really as we are dependent on you in a relationship. Would you grow your fruit in us, that we would look more like you so that others would want what we have, what they too can have in a relationship with you. And Lord, would you, in your good timing, produce all of these fruit in our lives? All of them. Maybe not all every single day, but God, we trust you to produce all of them, again, so that we look like you. May you help us to be so attractive to others, Lord, that the seed that we have is one that they too partake of and begin a relationship with you. And in this way, Lord, may we truly grow a life that matters, fruitful living. In your name, amen.
Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a donor-supported, nonprofit global ministry dedicated to making the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible come alive for people all around the world.